This video is going to be about some of the tanks being used in Ukraine, and I'm bound to say this, aren't I? I told you so. I want to talk about tanks today, and I want to talk about Ukraine. We're coming up to a year since Russia invaded Ukraine with about 1,500 tanks that were there and available for the Russian forces at the time. Ukraine at the time had about 1,000. And we've seen that progression through the media of how Ukraine has stymied that Russian initial advance and led to a war of attrition and a winter of pretty appalling conditions all round for both armies. But let's take some of that apart and let's see how, with the time I'm filming this, the tank has been in the news all week as Western NATO nations come to decisions about providing more tanks to the Ukrainians and what those tanks might be being used for, and why, after a year in which so often the tank was on the news as being a has-been thing, if they're going to be taken out by top attack weapons, why on earth should tanks now suddenly seem to be so prominent in a completely different way in the media? So let's go back. When the Russians invaded, they were using small tactical battle groups or battalions that they'd learnt about from their use in going into the Crimea earlier on, when Russia took Crimea and the Donbass and some areas there. That idea that the Russians had reformed under Putin their military, new equipment, new uniforms, some more high tech, the fact of these smaller tactical battalions, and the idea there is that, again, we were very impressed in the West, Western intelligence, etc., looking at this, thinking, hang on, they definitely have learnt lessons and reformed here. And so those battalions, the way they were put together, so they had combined arms together, so tanks, artillery, self-propelled, logistical support, sometimes engineer supports, all at a lower battalion level rather than separated within a division or a regiment. That idea seemed to be very impressive. So, of course, everybody was struck by the fact that when Russia invaded, this failed. It didn't work in the way they were expecting it to, and it certainly didn't work in the sense that the Ukrainians picked on and interdicted these Russian advances in a way that was quite staggering to many people. So why was that? What went wrong for the Russians in that way? Well, number one, the Ukrainians were using NLAWs and Javelins, top attack weapons, which could take out a tank, and did so. The Russian efforts to protect themselves against top attack, they started building things, they called them cope cages, cages with sandbags or metal structures on top of turrets. They look like they were improvised designs. Many of them, if you actually look at them closely, they differ from unit to unit. They were obviously aware of the threat of top attack, but these improvisations that the Russians did just didn't seem to make any difference whatsoever. The Ukrainians as well were using technology in a way that perhaps for the first time we've been seeing, because this has been a media war. So much of what's going on has been recorded by the Ukrainians and that footage released, less so with the Russians, but obviously they're targeting their propaganda not so much towards the Western nations, more toward India, Pakistan, China, etc. But I'd throw a note of caution there quite quickly. We are looking at this war through a glass darkly. We are not seeing everything that's going on, and that's something as well that many commentators have pointed out. And it's also something I'd be a bit wary of, because we're going to learn much more about what went on in due course. And I would also say, because it's an ongoing war, we are not going to be saying things that one may give succor to the Russians or undermine Ukrainian confidence. And equally as well, that there's some issues are going on that quite simply that nobody wants to see debated in the wider press yet, because some of these are still issues that they're trying to keep secret. But those Ukrainian attacks, we can see it's pretty obvious in a number of areas why and where they succeeded. Drones being used to spot where the Russian columns were, where the Russian attacks were taking place, etc., and being used to target artillery fire onto those Russian positions. So that was something that, again, that has been seen in this war in a way that just hasn't been to the extent it was, before. This is new from that side of it. So Western technology, clever attack tactics by the Ukrainians, so some hit and run, they're there, they're back. Their communications were much better in many areas than the Russians. And the Russians as well, it was so obvious quite quickly that some of this front that we had led to believe about Putin's new Russian army was pretty hollow around the edges. Their logistics supply broke down quickly. Vehicle maintenance, it was obvious things hadn't been looked after properly. Training of crews and some of the infantry just weren't there into a standard that the Ukrainians would be able to take advantage of this. So those were things as well that let the Russian side down, as well as that Ukrainian novelty of tactics, using water courses as defensive lines, which again slowed up these Russian columns and Russian attack forces. And one extra element that I seem to think gets overlooked too often at the moment is the fact that NATO, British, American, other countries were training Ukrainian forces before the war. And their big message that's come back that really worked for the Ukrainians and was a major change from that old Soviet era doctrine that so many, the Ukrainians and the Russian military had kind of trained under, the difference was that Western idea of mission command. You end up saying to your forces, this is what the commander wants you to achieve. How you achieve that on the field of battle is then delegated much further down to the frontline troops, to the commanders in the field, not hierarchically held onto by figures behind the scenes. And that really works for the Ukrainians. It was a revelation to many Ukrainian soldiers that way, and the fact it's been working against the Russians, who were still using this very dated command and control where any sort of order had to go up to the hierarchy before it was allowed to, something could be changed or some maneuver made, etc., which was slower. Their radio communications were being interdicted. They were slower at this anyway, what's called C2, command and control, not very good from the Russians' point of view. So that's one of those areas where it's not just about the equipment, but it's about the training that Ukrainians really benefited from their NATO teachers that were teaching them before the war began. Now, there's another element I would put in there as well, which is, again, for the failures of some of that the first 6 months of the Russian situation or their attacks, etc. And that was, again, I would go back to morale. You look at some of the situations where some of those Russian soldiers, again, some of the tank crews even, they weren't told they were actually going on a real attack. These were maneuvers that were going to be taking place. There is obviously a corrupt system under Putin, morally, bankrupt in so many ways. The Ukrainians, whatever their problems of the country behind them, they are united in realizing that this is an attack they have to defend against. So morally, and their morale is actually very high, and how they've come together has worked perfectly with the tie-in with the old and the new, using new technologies, getting those drones, adapting things, doing things just so sensibly, very quickly. Early on, they realized, look, if we centralize too many of our forces, our supply depots, the way we're going to repair and look after equipment, we are going to be attacked by Russian missiles, by Russian artillery, so many ways that they could help denigrate the Ukrainians' ability to supply its own troops, etc. So that's been spread out. Every town garage is basically now a repair workshop for the Ukrainian military. They don't have central depots in that way. So lots of ideas like this Ukrainians were picking up on, and with that support, this is now a nation at war with the full backing of its populace, which again is something in the West, certainly in Britain, we've not seen for some time. That idea that we've been seeing, Afghanistan, Iraq, people were supportive of the troops, but we certainly weren't a country at war. There was no war footing, industry, etc. Most people went about their daily lives completely oblivious to the fact that British soldiers were fighting in another part of the world. Ukraine, complete opposite of that. Everybody's aware of the situation. Everybody's involved in some way or another. Now, what's often talked about is the supply of NATO weaponry and high-tech weaponry to Ukraine, and there's areas where that is undoubtedly given the Ukrainians great advantage. We often see about NLAWs and Javelins taking out Russian tanks, but there's other areas where, for example, HIMARS, high mobility artillery rocket systems, whopping great batteries of rockets that are put on the back of trucks, etc., driven around, given by Western nations. The Ukrainians were using those to target Russian ammunition dumps. And if you look online, there's some amazing footage of quite major Russian supply centers being targeted by HIMARS. The Russians, in response, put their Pantsir anti-missile systems next to wherever the areas were they wanted to defend. And they started bringing down the incoming HIMARS rockets. So in response to that, the Americans gave the Ukrainians the AGM-88 missile, which it can target anti-missile systems. That's what it's designed to do. So what that led to is then HIMARS were back in business and they weren't being interdicted by the Russians. So this cat and mouse game of technology, certainly that supply of some of the better technology has really helped the Ukrainians in their defensive battles. Having said all of that, by the summer, last summer, Ukrainians had lost about 50% of their assets, if we just do that as a broad brush picture. That's a lot there. So those NATO's resupplying, it was really important for them. And another side as well that was going on as well is the Ukrainians, because of this Russian advances trying to take territory, the Ukrainians, it's their territory. So they are desperately trying to stop Russian advances. That meant they were building defensive positions, and that meant as well that the Russians had the opportunity of using their great god of war, artillery, to actually decimate Ukrainian forces in a number of areas. Great if you can afford to maneuver, great if you can afford to actually use the expanse of the countryside. That was great in some areas for Ukrainians, but if you're trying to hold a serious line, hold a piece of strategically important ground, that means the Russians had the opportunity of firing their shells at them. We think so far in the war, about 7 million shells have been fired by the Russians. And it's the artillery, of course, that's really doing the damage. On the media all the time, we tend to focus on these high-tech weapon systems, odd moments. It's that attritional warfare of heavy barrages, and we are talking, World War I type barrages now, going down onto Ukrainian positions. Early days, the Ukrainians were in a position they could almost counter battery fire and match that Russian fire. As time wore on, their stocks got so depleted, the number of tubes or weapon systems they'd got for firing back end up being diminished as well. Hence that great need for NATO to replenish their stocks, ammunition, etc. Russia can probably make about 3 million rounds a year. We think 7 million's been fired. They may well have about 10 million still in stocks. But the higher end weaponry they've got through much quicker. So again, the Russians, once their initial attacks were stymied, they start using missile attacks, initially not that effectively. Later on, going for Ukrainian infrastructure, power stations, etc. That's where, again, they've had an effect. So if you look at satellite photos of Ukraine, lit up at night before these attacks, look at them now, and most of the country's dark. So that idea, the Russians were changing their tactics to try and pick on areas of the Ukrainian defences that they knew would be vulnerable. And I want to bring that in now because there has been a little bit of a tendency, certainly in NATO and the West, to denigrate. I've just done it by saying about how poor some of those Russian troops seem to be in those early attacks. But RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, they've done a number of reports. They often say at the beginning of their reports, look, this is how we're looking at a situation from the best we can understand it, not a full clear picture yet. And equally, they're saying, we're not going to tell you too much about what's going on at the moment, because again, they don't want to give the Russians any false information or other information that might benefit them. But RUSI said this in a recent report, and this is why I want to read this quote, because I think it's quite an important one that we don't underestimate that Russian army and don't fall into the trap of belittling them in a way as if they're ineffective. So they said, the perception that Russian forces are systematically incompetent, irredeemably corrupt, that their weapons are ineffective and unreliable, and that the force is incapable of adapting. This narrative is dangerous, both because it is inaccurate and also because it encourages complacency. So I mention that because obviously the Russians are learning lessons from their earlier mistakes. They are reconfiguring forces. They've actually done very well in some battles that perhaps we've been in the West given the impression that they've failed there, but actually they manoeuvred 30,000 troops. They got them out of what they would consider a Dunkirk type situation. They redeployed them. They saved most of their equipment. There's things that go on where actually it's obvious that they are learning lessons. And that again is always a worry, because how much longer will it be? Will Putin be able to rally the Russian people in the sense of a great patriotic war? Will industry start regurgitating, starting to come back to the Russian army with upgraded bits of vehicles, new pieces of kit, things taken out of store that obviously were not being effective? Will they be refurbished enough? And the fact that those Russian resources are potentially greater, certainly than Ukraine's, but certainly with Ukraine and NATO backing. Can they match each other? Who's going to run out of puff first is one of those big sort of questions now. We're into a year into the war. So looking at that, the debate that's been going on recently, which is Ukraine asking for 300 Western tanks. Now, at the moment, it could well be that about 1,600 Russian tanks are being knocked out in the fighting so far. Some are very well documented, some are underestimating. It's perhaps estimated about 100,000 on both sides have been made casualties. You know, these are huge numbers. This is a really serious war we're looking at. So how could just perhaps 300 Western or NATO tanks make a difference in the future? Ukraine obviously wants tanks, which again I would come back to. Bit of an irony when in the West we were saying actually with these top attack weapons, tanks are out of business now and old hat, they've been superseded on the battlefield by other systems. Wrong, as has so often in the past been said before. Just recently a US general came out with a line, you know, you don't need tanks unless you want to win. And that's why the Ukrainians want tanks back in their inventory, and tanks that will overmatch the T-64s, the T-72s, the T-80s, not many of them, but now some T-90s that the Russians are deploying. They like the idea of the Western tanks because of their mobility, their firepower, and obviously they're much better protected with defensive aid suites, etc., and laminate armour than their Russian army equivalents and their own tanks that they've been fighting up to this stage. The thought is a couple of corps will be formed, and if they do get those 300 tanks, they've got that opportunity of bringing mobility back so that when they are going to counter-strike, and one assumes both sides are building up for a spring or summer offensive, they will have that mobility again and a superior edge on the battlefield. Now, there's been dangerous things said in the press, almost as if these Western tanks are, you know, invulnerable, etc. They're not. Let's just be honest about these things. That's not the case. Tank for tank, of course, they tend to have better technology, better crew protection, better sighting and longer range firepower, but we're still only talking at this moment in time about modest numbers. Challenger 2, Abrams, Leopards. Leopards often cited as the tank the Ukrainians want because we're talking larger numbers are available and larger stocks of spares and supplies are all ready to go. And that's quite important, of course, because they really need these vehicles sooner rather than later. There's another element to this as well I just want to bring into play, which is very important as well. We seem to think as well of those tanks going on forever because we're talking about building bases, perhaps in Poland. The tanks can come back to be looked after logistically, to be refurbished or to be rekitted out if they suffer any damage in Ukraine. It may well be that just the supply of those tanks help Ukraine win a battle on a given day, and this we're not knowing where that future's going with the war, why that winning a battle on a certain day may be vitally important. Think of it potentially like a boxing match. Again, the slugging's going on, this attritional warfare over the winter. But what if there's that chance for a knockout blow? Then those tanks being operated, being used just for one day, may make the difference. And that's why, again, so sometimes when we're looking at what's going to be a tank that's sustainable, that the crews can train more easily on, that we've got enough ammunition and spare parts for, etc., actually it could be a one-off weapon system sometimes that does the business. Now, I mention about tanks because, again, watch this. This is going to be changing even by the time we actually publish this video. No doubt there'll be more news, etc. But last week, British intelligence, not only had they been talking about what tanks the Russians had been deploying and the failures of some of those tanks against Ukrainian defences, but they also mentioned the T-14 tank. And this famous, the Russian Armata that so much was said about in the media, again was being offered for the first time, according to British intelligence, to the Russian army fighting in Ukraine. The Russian army has refused it because citing engine problems, the sighting systems not being working properly. They can't replenish those because they're not actually Russian sighting systems. So there's a number of issues with those T-14s that has meant, really they're a test body of vehicles that have been built so far, but it looked like the Russian field army has turned down actually operating them as being just simply too risky, let alone the propaganda problem of if they're falling into Ukrainian hands or being knocked out, etc., it's just not going to look good. This the latest big thing, supposedly, from the Russian tank industry fails that way. Ukraine obviously wants tanks for the very good reason they can help bring mobility back on the battlefield. But isn't it interesting how we see the tank in the media all the time? When they were being destroyed, they were being seen as a symbol of power being destroyed. Now they're being seen again as perhaps the answer to the Ukrainians' prayers. They're one of only many weapon systems that Ukrainians are going to be needing in the future, and they're going to be needing a lot more than perhaps has been promised at the moment. But they're still, and the way commentators are suddenly taken on board now, that the tank is still essential on that battlefield in a way that only months ago it was almost considered old hat. Now, I just want to end by saying one of those things that we talk about here sometimes is we're talking about this too often in the abstract. These are real people fighting out there. I've just said earlier that figure, 100,000 potential casualties on both sides. That's a lot of young people, and from the Ukrainian side, a lot of their infrastructure, a lot of their homes, people killed there. This is something we need to end sooner. And the irony, of course, is if the NATO is supplying these with this equipment, one hopes that's going to help and not just prolong a war, but also we're seeing a war where that moral element is so important. And the fact that we're watching things going on, simplicity and high tech, runners taking messages because radio communications cannot be trusted on. You know, things that happened back in the First World War, trenches, scenes that look like the First World War sometimes in Ukraine at the moment, and again, high-tech weapons. All of those are on the battlefield at the same time. And that ability, that adaptability, the need and the ability to use, whether it's high-tech or simple systems, gives me the feeling that the Ukrainians are going to win this.